Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I see folks from countries all over the world in our chat, so welcome everybody. Welcome to this World Management Agility Forum webinar with my three colleagues today, who we'll introduce shortly. Our goal is to share and communicate the need, the urgent need, the approach to reimagining value creation in the 21st century. We're going to propose three dimensions. First, reimagining the economics of value, or as Mark puts it, what is value? There's an old discredited economics that influences thinking about business more than we sometimes acknowledge, and it's time to discard it and adopt the philosophy and the principles of subjective value. And Mark Packard will guide us here. Second, acknowledging value creation as innovation and reimagining the value technology, the value organization, the approaches and methods for innovation. And Kurt Carlson is here. He lives on the leading edge of innovation, and he's going to give us a tour. And then reimagining value management, how we apply these value creation principles at the business level, the partnership level, even the contract level between individual firms, identifying the things that really matter. And we have Chris Valley here to share his many, many years of experience in value management. So let me just go around the clock and let each of our co-hosts introduce themselves. Mark?
Yeah, hi, I'm Mark Packard. I'm a tenured professor of management at Florida Atlantic University with an emphasis in entrepreneurship. I'm also the research director of the Madden Center for Value Creation hosted here at FAU. And I've also authored a book called Entrepreneurial Valuation, which we'll talk about a little bit.
Thank you, Mark. Kurt?
Yeah. My name's I was the former CEO of SRI International in the heart of Silicon Valley. You probably know about us because of the computer mouse and Siri and high definition television. Now I run my own little company called Innovation for Impact, and I mostly work with universities. I'm at the WPI Northeastern and many other universities around actually the world.
Okay. Thank you, Kurt. And Chris?
Hi, I'm Chris, and I guess I'm here to talk about value management because of having witnessed firsthand how what's going on. Okay.
You're okay, Chris.
Am I clear? Good. Hi, I'm Chris, and I guess I'm here to talk about value management because having witnessed firsthand how the apparent rock-solid culture built by Bill Hewlett and Dave
I think we just lost Chris's audio.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Did you get any of that?
Go through it again quickly.
Okay. So I'm Chris, and I guess I'm here to talk about value management because having witnessed firsthand how the apparently rock-solid culture built by Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard unraveled in the mid to late 1980s. So we decided to set up new information paradigms in 1990 to find ways to make value principles explicit, conscious and measurable so they could be embedded, spread and scaled across distributed networks and ecosystems.
Good. Thank you. Well, let's let Mark give us our foundation today, the principles, the economics, the philosophy of subjective value. Mark?
All right. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about value theory and how understanding value correctly will change the way you do business. So the fundamental question I want to ask is, what is value? Values, it's one of those concepts that's kind of like time, right? So we have a good general sense of what it is, but if you ever stop to really think about it, you quickly discover that it's not really that easy to define at all. right? But if you don't really understand value, or worse, if you misunderstand value, you end up thinking that you're creating value, but really what you're really doing is taking a gamble on what you think might be valuable. And this is why I think the vast majority of businesses tend to really struggle with innovation and figuring out really what's going to work or not, and why a lot of new products and ventures fail. So again, what is value? If you ask an economist, they'll probably tell you that value is utility, by which they mean just usefulness, right? A thing is valuable to the extent that it's useful to us. But if you've ever had a deeper conversation about value, you've probably heard that value is subjective. But what does that mean? Well, again, if you ask an economist, they'll tell you that what subjective value means is that value is different for different people. But remember, they define value as utility. So a thing's utility is different for different people. Now, that's certainly true, but that's not really what subjective value really means. Or I should say, that's not what subjectivists mean by subjective value. And subjectivism is a philosophy of science that has staked a position contrary to the view that the world of people can be studied in the same way as the world of things, right? Like rocks and chemicals and magnets, right? So subjectivists argue that people can't be treated as data because we're thinking beings. We have consciousness and intentions, right? We're not just robots programmed to react to inputs, which is surprisingly how a lot of social scientists actually think of people, or at least that's how they treat them in their research. So, for subjectivists, value is not objective, albeit individual, right? Things don't have value. Things are valued, right? So value is a verb for subjectivists. But actually, let me clarify that, because there's two forms of the word value that are meaningful, right? So value is a verb, as I just said, right? So we value things because we expect them to make our lives better. But as a noun, value can be understood as the actual making our lives better, right? The process of increasing our well-being, right? So value as a noun occurs for a person if they move from a state of lower well-being to a state of higher well-being. And so we sometimes call this value as a noun the value experience, or experienced value. But it's noteworthy that this value as a noun is actually a very different conception of value than what is often called intrinsic value, right? There's no actual such thing as intrinsic value. We sometimes say that gold, for example, has intrinsic value, but that's not exactly right. Gold is valuable because we value it. Sure, it has certain properties that can be used to do certain things. But the point is, like, if we found other things that did all of those things that gold does better than gold does, then gold would cease to be valuable to us. And so, the fact that value is both a noun and a verb, that there's an actual experienced value, but also that we value things, and that these words, these forms of the word are different, is actually pretty consequential, because we decide what we want based on value as a verb, how we value things. But then our values, how much we value things, confronts reality in the experience of value, right? Value as a noun, and those don't always match up, right? So we update our value as a verb, how much we value things, based on that value as a noun experience. So if we're dissatisfied with the actual value as a noun experience, we change how much we value as a verb that thing, which changes what we will choose to do in the future. So now that we kind of understand what value is, we're in a better position to answer the question, where does value come from? And the answer to this, which Professor Carlson will talk more about, is that value comes from our innovative efforts to find new and better ways to solve our needs, to increase our well-being. Okay, so life entails this endless cycle of value learning, where we experience things and then we assess those experiences and learn from them what things give us better or worse value experiences. And then from that, we value the things that do that, give us the most satisfaction the most, right? And so in other words, we're constantly trying to figure out how to live our best life and how to satisfy all of our needs most optimally. And it's in this value learning cycle that we discover new value. And we discover new value for ourselves by trying new things, by learning about our needs and finding or even innovating new solutions to address those needs, right? In a trial and error process often. But we also can discover new value for others, which is what you have to do in business, through what we call entrepreneurial empathy. So if you want to improve the value and performance of your new products, you have to learn to empathize with your potential customers at a deep level, right? So Steve Jobs said it very well. A lot of customers don't know what they want until you show it to them. But why don't they know what they want? Well, it's because they are in this value learning cycle too, right? They are trying to, like the rest of us, to figure out what's most valuable to them and how to live their best life. So how are you supposed to know what they should want before they do? You know, that's a tough question to answer, but to do that, you need to understand them and their needs at a profound level, maybe even better than they understand themselves. And that takes a lot of research. It takes a lot of effort to get into their minds. But I should say, though, remember that you're a consumer too. So you can learn from your own consumer experiences. But also you do need to remember that everyone's experiences of value and of reality are different. So you can't rely solely on your own personal value experiences. You do have to go out and talk to people to get into their lives and experiences so that you can understand them. I think that's about my time, so I'll turn it back. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Mark. One of my, I've got to check my microphone, I think. So one of my favorite quotes is from Andrew Carnegie, who was running the most valuable company in the world in the 19th century. And he said, "The needs of the people turn what was previously worthless into value." So that's my segue to Kurt, who talks about needs all the time. Kurt.
Okay, thank you, Hunter. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mark, for that great introduction to what value is. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, so I used to work for RCA, and it was bought by GE, and then one day we were transferred over to the part I was at was transferred over to SRI. And this was a life-changing experience because I used to spend millions of dollars in RCA and GE. And all of a sudden in SRI, I discovered I had to earn millions of dollars. And like most people in big companies, I really didn't know how to do that. So we set out on a journey to discover how can we actually be successful with this new game we had to play. After a number of years, I eventually became CEO of the company. When I went to the headquarters here in Silicon Valley, the company had been failing for 20 years and was going towards bankruptcy. The buildings were falling down, and there were lots of grudges. And when I left, we grew 3.5 times. My teams won 2 Emmys, one for high-definition television, one for satellite quality. Nuance, that was 20 billion. Siri, everybody knows, that was bought by Steve Jobs, and Intuitive Surgical, which is over $100 billion. So the ideas I'm going to discuss to you today are very simple ones, but they were enough to transform an organization from failing for 20 years to being able to create one multi-billion-dollar business after another. Now, this starts when I've done workshops with hundreds of companies, and typically what you discover is performance is pretty poor. I mean, there are exceptions, But typically, we find less than 25% of what they're working on with any value if it was completed. They decide that. We just give them a framework for that. So the question is, why are they not being successful? It's not because they lack great people. They have great people. It's because oftentimes they're focusing on things that are interesting to them but not important. You have to work on important unmet end user and market needs if you're going to make an impact. The second thing is you need to share the language of value creation. Interdisciplinary teams all come in with their unique knowledge, is essential. But the one language they have to have is the language of the customer. So they have to share the concepts, tools, and methods aimed at the customer. That's the second thing. And the third thing is there needs to be a recurring way to be able to bring the teams together to synthesize solutions faster than the competition. I walk into a company, I look for these things. If they have them in some form, I know they're going to be successful. If they don't, it's going to be episodic. Okay. So here's some concepts that we often find that are missing. The definition of customer value, I just talked about that. Benefits over cost, and as you pointed out, it's always subjective. The second is the value creation. That's the process of identifying and addressing an important end user need with a solution that's better than any alternative and it addresses the needs of all stakeholders. And the key thing we're after here is that new customer value becomes an innovation when it's in the marketplace with a sustainable business model so people can actually buy it. If people don't use it, it's not an innovation. It's very simple. It might be an invention, but if they don't use it, it's not an innovation. So this is what we consider to be the most important definition when you start any new initiative that has value for others. We want to address an important yet unmet end user and market need with a unique, compelling, and defensible approach for the offering and its business model, of course, with superior benefits per cost when compared to the competition and all other alternatives. 4 critical questions. It's very hard to answer these 4 questions. They all interact with each other. So if the need changes, for example, the other 3 have to change as well. And what we discovered, if you can answer these 4 questions, you're probably going in a pretty good direction. If you cannot answer these 4 questions, it's almost always going to lead to failures. We start with the most basic questions first, because innovation is a very complex activity. Here's one of the biggest mistakes. People mistake problems for needs. It's the biggest mistake. We see it all the time. They see a problem and they jump to a solution, but it's never right. A problem is a situation that's causing difficulty or trouble. For instance, a problem might be, I'm always late for work. Okay. A need is something that's necessary or required by the person. The need in this case could be, I need a more reliable method of transportation. But it could be he needs an Uber, or it means he needs a new car, it needs to be repaired, or he needs a new alarm clock. You can't know that until you interact with your customer. So in principle, the big mistake is problems are not in general needs. How do you bring teams together? We use what we call value creation forums. They're not like most incubation programs. We bring in 3 to 6 teams every 1 to 6 weeks, and they give very short 3 to 5 minute NABC value propositions. They give them and then they're quiet and they get feedback. We use a multiple of learning techniques. One is called reframing. It's a really powerful way to help people, not to make the problem of mistaking a problem for a need. First, we always say what's good, how to improve it, eyes of the end user, eyes of the funder. We're looking at the problem from the presentation from the point of view of all the stakeholders. And that helps people get unstuck and actually figure out more clearly what they want to do. It's really powerful. Here's an idea that people like, but it typically forms problems in every company we've ever been in. Everybody here knows about the idea of a minimum viable product. There's nothing wrong with that idea. It's a question of how it's used. It's often used as an excuse to build something before it's really been, the value proposition has been worked out. We strongly recommend minimum viable experiments before minimum viable products. If you can't address the risks of your initiative, it probably means you're not quite on the right track. So we have people create a chart like this for what they do. What's the type of the risk, customer? What's the issue? What's the current risk? What's the impact if you don't solve it? And then what's a risk mitigation plan? We did this at SRI. It was the reason why we could create multi-billion-dollar ventures without spending a lot of money. We didn't have much money. You mitigate the risk. As you mitigate the risk, the value goes up, and then you can keep on going. Okay, I obviously am not going through everything in this presentation. The point I want to make, though, is you need to start with the fundamentals. The fundamentals are an NABC value proposition. Then you add other ingredients as appropriate as you need to, as you can, to flesh out the value proposition for what you're doing, or the plan for what you're doing. And then eventually it turns into an improved product, new product, venture, or license. What we see over and over again is what we call the leap to failure. People see a problem, then they work like crazy to create a venture pitch, and it just doesn't make any sense. It's just not right. You got to start on the left-hand side of this curve if you want to be systematically efficient and effective. I end with the fact that we're in the world of AI, and we can't talk about that too much, but AI now is fundamental to everything I do and everything I teach. We use it as scripts to teach the big ideas of value creation. There are about 10 of them. We have a script for each one of them. You can benchmark in the virtual world what you're doing. Amazing what you can learn now with OpenAI. And then you keep on reframing, asking, how could this be improved? How could this improved over and over again? And get more insights and more ideas to flesh out your value proposition. Now, of course, AI can't create a solution. Only you can do that. That's the human part of this. And you have to protect your IP and verify all the facts. But it is an enormous teaching aid, and it's an enormous amplifier of our ability to come up with ideas for value creation and innovation. I can't imagine not using it today. And with that, and I think we can improve our performance at least 2 to 10 times as we go forward with this. Okay, that's it, Hunter. That's my story.
Good. Well, thank you, Kurt. We'll come back to you with a couple of questions, but we've talked about the foundational philosophy and principles. You've talked about the creative and intelligent end of value creation through NABC. Chris is on the factory floor and the company floor actually doing value creation management. So Chris, let's hand over to you and talk about how you apply all of this thinking in your work. You're muted.
Okay.
There you go.
Can you hear me now, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'd like to pick up on the polarity point raised by Doug Kirkpatrick in the last forum session, and the idea that tensions and dilemmas always exist, and that balancing and managing them with dexterity is essential for long-term success. So I'd like to imagine, if you will, 2 poles, one way over to the left, the other way over to the right. And you can think of them as planets or magnets, each exerting an attracting force which gets stronger the nearer you get to the pole. So I'd like to put the stasis label on the left-hand pole, because that's where nothing can change, and put a chaos label on the right-hand pole, because that's the state of total disorder. And now imagine that there's a relatively narrow sweet zone between the poles, which somehow manages to defy and utilize the pull of the poles. This is a zone of complexity and complex adaptive systems. And to stay in that state of unstable equilibrium, the system has to exploit resources, existing resources, to survive in the short term, but also explore new resources and new sources of resources to thrive in the future. Now, the control mechanisms provide the order necessary to maintain the left-hand boundary of the sweet zone, and autonomy or freedom provides the scope for the creativity necessary to maintain the right-hand boundary of the sweet zone. So we have control and order on the left, and creativity and autonomy on the right. And the underlying attracting force holding the system together in that unstable equilibrium is value. And the evaluation is the process the system uses to discern at what point and for how long to engage in the exploit mode, and at what point and for how long to engage in the explore mode. A continuous dynamic balancing act, minimizing waste whilst maximizing choice, if you will, agility in action. Now, there's a recently proposed physical law called the law of increasing functional information, which seems to imply that there are 3 universal types or patterns, each of which reveals an important aspect of value creation, which can be mapped to the polarity model. Now, towards the left-hand side of the sweet zone, there is foundational value, which is encapsulated or embodied in replicable, reusable, ordered elements or modules. Repeatability without change is the key. And because there's no need for the system to react to change, there's scope for it to generate a surplus. In the middle of the sweet zone, there is adaptive value, where some of the surplus is used to detect and respond to any gradual changes that are impacting the system. And then towards the right-hand side of the sweet zone, there is evolutionary value, where the rate of external change is outpacing the system's ability to adapt, requiring it to actively seek and incorporate external novelty in the system. So in summary, foundational value is fixed and repeat success. Adaptive value is a response to gradual change. And evolutionary value is about getting ahead of change through innovation. Now, in order to realize value, that is to make it real, we need to introduce time into our model, which we can do by imagining the sweet zone between the poles as a pathway or highway stretching out ahead, starting at the current state and unfolding as a series of desired future states. So we've got a model, but how do you use it in practice? Well, as Steve Denning has raised in this group, a new paradigm or new management paradigm is emerging that recognizes and utilizes the differences that make a difference between the hemispheres of the brain, as set out in detail by Ian McGilchrist. But for our purposes, there's the insight that we ourselves as individuals are living, breathing, and potentially conscious, complex, adaptive systems. And more directly, each hemisphere of the brain reflects or relates to its equivalent on the bounded pathway or highway we've been imagining. The left brain maintains the left-hand boundary of the sweet zone, and the right brain maintains the right-hand boundary. This is important because it means individuals, organizations, and ecosystems all exist in a similar sweet zone and are subject to and have to deal with the same explore dynamic, using value as an attractor to operate as a complex adaptive system. Now, McGilchrist has voiced his concern that the algorithmic left brain is dominating thinking and discourse at the expense of the holistic right brain, leading to an obsession with order and control through numbers. But there is a natural way forward, and that is by relentlessly focusing on the things that matter. Why? Because uncovering, articulating, and evaluating the things that matter acts as a generative constraint, enabling the hemispheres to reintegrate with one another through the process of consciously valuing. Now, there are a couple of reasons why the things that matter phrase itself is so powerful. Firstly, it's a very common phrase that's easily understood and acted upon. Everyone has a view on the things that are important and relevant in particular situations and circumstances. And secondly, the things that matter are a proxy for value. They represent value. So we can quickly get to the heart of matter without having to define what value is or isn't. Another important point is that when we're clear about what matters to us, then we can then step back and consider what matters to other internal teams or external organizations. And exploring what matters to the other party is a powerful empathy building exercise or process. But although things that matter are the beating heart of value creation and value management, we still need to operationalize a process so that it can be embedded, spread, and scaled. So I now like to imagine a template, maybe in landscape mode, of what we call a value code. Each value code has a title and a description, followed by a set or table of 5 evaluation labels, each with its associated evaluation statements set out beneath it. Typically, the statements express 5 progressively more challenging desired states. So, for example, the range might be from barely acceptable through to an ideal final state. Now, the more detailed and situation-specific the statements are, and the more involved users are in the creation process, the better, because users know what reflects best practice and what KPIs, OKRs, etc., should be incorporated in order to differentiate between the evaluation statements. In other words, they know the difference that makes a difference to performance. Now, of course, The set of value codes will shift over time. Some will drop out and some will come in according to changing circumstances. And some value codes will expand out to create potentially a more detailed taxonomy, if you will. For example, a generic value code like security may be factored out into cyber security and site security. One more point. Once a set of value codes is in place, it's possible to consciously choose and keep a record of where and how limited resources have been applied and allocated and moved across the set. Right, so now we have a way to measure or evaluate value. Let's look at how value coding actually supports those three universal value types that I mentioned earlier. Foundational value is expressed through the set of value codes, specifically the form of their structure and content. Adaptive value comes out of the review process itself. Has anything changed? Do we need to react? And evolutionary value emerges when individuals and teams creatively recognize an opportunity for a completely new value code or for an innovative jump to a higher evaluation score or statement. Now, value coding also impacts individuals. Specifically, the left brain relates to the list, to the structure and formality of value codes, and the scope to attribute and capture numerical evaluation scores. And the right brain relishes the opportunity to explore the big picture and come up with creative solutions to close gaps between the evaluation statements that represent a current state of dissatisfaction or unease and those representing a more desirable future state, all contributing to a greater sense of well-being and purpose. So I'd just like to finish on what McGilchrist has to say about the two hemispheres, because let's face it, that's what we're using to identify needs, to decide whether something's value, etc. So if we don't know how our own systems work, then where do you go from there? Okay, so McGilchrist says, in the left hemisphere, the world is simplified in the service of manipulation. It is made of isolated, static things that are already known, familiar, predetermined, and fixed. They are fragments that are devoid of context, disembodied and meaningless, abstract, generic in nature, quantifiable, fungible, mechanical, and lifeless. This is the world that is constructed after the fact, literally two-dimensional, schematic, theoretical. Here, the future is a fantasy that remains under our control. So the left hemisphere is unreasonably optimistic and fails to see the dangers that loom. And in the right hemisphere, by contrast, there is a world of flowing processes, not isolated things, one where nothing is simply fixed or entirely certain, exhaustively known or fully predictable, but always changing and ultimately interconnected with everything else. A world where context is everything, where what exists are wholes, where what really matters is implicit, a world of uniqueness, one where quality is more important than quantity, a world that is essentially animate. Here, the future is the product of realism, not denial. This is the world that is fully present, rich, complex, a world of experience which calls for understanding. The right hemisphere is more cautious and more realistic. Over to you, Hunter.
Chris, thank you very much for that. So we've looked at those three dimensions. Before I sum up at the end, there are a couple of questions that came through. We'll start with you, Mark. I've heard you say in your business teaching that if we don't understand value, we sometimes have some activities in the firm that are not value creating. We might think they are, but they're not. Can you just illustrate that a little bit and how we sort between them?
Yeah, so I mean, this happens particularly with entrepreneurs, but in all kinds of activities of the firm, the ultimate goal is to facilitate or create value for your customer. But if you don't understand what the customer really needs, you end up doing things that even if your customer says that they want it, end up not being as satisfactory, as helpful as they need to be, and as a result, the performance is underwhelming. So when you're developing a new product, you want to understand what the customer experience is really like at a very deep level, so that you can really address, as Kurt was saying, the problem, the need, rather than the symptoms. And it needs to be much better than just a little bit better than what's out there.
Good. Well, that's a good segue to Kurt. Kurt, you said you couldn't say too much about AI, but you just circulated a paper that talks about the orders of magnitude of improvement in AI, 10x and more in very short periods of time. People ask, for your kind of approach, which part is AI and which part is human, the creative, instinctive, intuitive part that Chris talked about, the right brain part, and how will that change over time?
Well, at its fundamental core, value creation is a learning discipline. It's a directed learning discipline. And so what you want to do is use the best learning methods, active learning, systems thinking. Mark and Chris both have alluded basically to some of those principles. There are fundamental things you need to answer, and there are fundamental frameworks you need to master. And what AI can do is complement the human part of it. So, as has been mentioned, you have to work with your customer and interact with them and iterate with them, because it's not obvious. They don't know what's possible, so they can't really predict. They didn't ask for the iPhone. They don't know what can be built. And ultimately, you can't really know what they need until you've interacted with them. Now, there are fundamental needs. I have a friend who says there are only 3 needs: time, money, and laughter. And if you can address those 3 fundamental needs, you're going to be successful. Well, okay, it's a little more complicated than that. And you can only figure that out with your customers. But Steve Jobs appealed to very fundamental. He didn't really talk to customers very much in the beginning, but then he would iterate like crazy. So, okay, so there's the human part that doesn't go away. You still got to interact with real people in real environments with real things. But underneath that, you have another tool that can do that kind of iteration, because iteration is the process for learning. And now you get to iterate not only in the real world, you get to iterate in the virtual world. And that is an enormous amplifier of our ability to learn. Now imagine in the future, if the 4 of us were working together, each one of us would not only have an AI tool to help us learn these things, we would have an AI tool. I'm developing one. It's going to be, it's virtual Kurt. I'm developing virtual Kurt, basically, which will include everything I've ever written, every video I've ever done. And I'm going to be able to apply it, not only to teach the ideas, but when people give presentations, my virtual sense will be able to iterate with them before they come into the real world. So these are huge amplifiers. I mean, it's not a little thing. It's actually a huge thing in terms of our ability to innovate. And it's scary, actually. So we're gonna augment the real world with a virtual world, but it's going to be a power tool. It's not going to be just another thing, another graph. It's going to be a power tool.
I can't wait for virtual Kurt. So, Chris, you talked about polarity.
Yeah.
And our colleague, Dr. Annika Steiber, talks about ambidexterity, that firms have to learn how to explore and exploit.
Yeah.
I kind of would love to challenge that and see if we can shift to more explore and less exploit, shift the balance back to the right brain, as you put it. What do you think?
Well, I think McGilchrist himself, the left brain, right brain person, is in despair at the moment, because it does seem to him that the left brain is totally dominant. So all I can say is that you've got to pivot over to consider how you make sense of the world. And what we're doing really with the whole concept of a value code is to eliminate that need to worry about it. Essentially asking people what matters to them gets to the root of value, and it's almost a question that goes straight into the right brain, because we all know right from birth, when you're little, the very first thing you get to learn is there anything the matter? What's the matter? So it's a very worn pathway in the brain, neural pathway. So I would just say, the way to get at it is to focus on the things that matter, give people the opportunity to express those. As they do that, they'll begin to recognize that they share things and so on. And then the process is to convert what those things that matter are into as we call them, value codes. So effectively begin to capture qualitative aspects and give them a quantitative spin. And as I was saying in my talk there, that helps the left brain as well. I mean, the left brain's not bad and the right brain's not good. That's definitely not the case. Absolutely not. It's just that if you have too much of one and not enough of the other, not a balance, then well, fundamentally, as I was saying, with the polarity, if you stay too close to the left side and you end up being too ordered, you hit bureaucracy and you get sucked into stasis, and then it's all over, basically.
Yeah. So, Mark, one more question for you. Kurt has hinted at the metaverse and the virtual worlds. I've got a question for him that came from Rainer Hansen, but I'll get to it in a second. Is subjectivism going to operate in the virtual world? Can I detect the subjective value in a virtual world?
Well, we can certainly value virtual things. But yeah, so as far as AI goes, AI cannot, as far as I understand, value things in the same way that we do. They can be an aid, they can be a help for us to figure out how to find things that we would value, but they cannot value things themselves. And so we'll still have a big role in the future of AI in valuing things and figuring out how to reach our best life.
So Kurt, Rainer Hansen asked, where can I find out more about virtual Kurt, which I'll translate as a question too. What's the best way to keep up with these advances in AI?
Yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn. I answer questions. I'm there all the time. I want to address Chris's issue with the left and the right-hand brain. It's absolutely true. Everything is true. The only way you solve that is by bringing different people together in a collaborative environment. You want both the left and the right, and the forums that we run are basically that way. It's how we were able to create one multi-billion-dollar business after another. You need both of those. You need the left and the right, and you have to make sure they're in the room. So that, by the way, about AI, will it have real value? So if you use my joke that value is about time, money, and laughter, when it can create jokes, we'll know we're done.
Well, let's wrap up there. So 3 takeaways. The reimagining of value creation is in 3 forms: a deep understanding, a new understanding of what is value. That's what Mark was talking about. A new mental model for subjective value. It originates in the customer domain. We've got to change the flow of our thinking, that it's from the customer to the producer and not vice versa. Second, value creation can be reimagined and accelerated, as Kurt explained, through a new form of what he just explained: iterative, creative collaboration between human teams, multiple people, and AI. And value creation will be the mastery of this combination and recombination. And then, as Chris said, we can bring the application of value management through these new concept of value coding, which he explained, but you can learn more at his website, on the things that really matter to both people and firms, and integrating the subjective and the objective, the right brain and the left. So those are the 3 takeaways. We'll be talking more about this at the World Management Agility Forum in Lisbon, September 19th through the 21st. And we hope to see you there. So Kurt, Chris, and Mark, thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank
cheers.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
still here, or are we gone?
I can hear you.